Welcome to this exclusive, a special report about what actually happens to the remains of the prisoners of war, otherwise known as POWs, and those considered missing in action MIA. We spent some time today with a little known agency in the US Department of Defense that does amazing work around the world. Mr. Kelly K. McHugh, Director of the Defense POWMIA Accounting Agency, otherwise known as the DPAA, spoke extensively at a press briefing organized by the Foreign Press Center in New York. He spoke about the efforts of the US government to investigate, recover, identify, and return close to 81,000 missing people from past conflicts as far back as the World War I and the Korean War.
We write no last chapters. We close no books. We put away no final memories. An end to America's involvement in Vietnam cannot come before we have achieved the fullest possible accounting of those missing in action.
This is something that the United States does, and a commitment that we make not only to the service member who made the supreme sacrifice in war, but it's also to their families. And their families, as you can imagine, are no different than Nigerian and German families, is that not only do they grieve the loss of their loved one from past wars, but when there's an uncertainty attached to it, where they obviously know that their loved one died in World War II, but not knowing and having those remains makes it an exacerbating set of circumstances for the family. And so not only do we do this with great vigor throughout the world, we work in 45 countries, still looking for 81,000 Americans missing from World War II through the Persian Gulf Wars. And these losses, predominantly from World War II, 75% are in the Indo-Pacific region, and the remainder are in Europe. But those 45 countries, we actually get great cooperation from. We look at this as a tool of diplomacy, a tool of engagement. Not only do we work closely with former enemies, but we also work with allies and partners, and even a China and a Russia, where the bilateral relationship may be tense, it may be at odds. We see this as being what we call a diplomatic carve-out, and that countries are willing to help and assist the United States in this search. And a lot of this begins with research and analysis. It migrates through field excavations, and then ultimately, if we do find remains, we bring them back to one of two laboratories where our scientists will identify them and hopefully repatriate them to their loved ones, who, as you can imagine, it brings great joy the fact that they are able to be home, and more importantly, get that closure that has been lacking for decades. We don't think so. Obviously we will, but right now it's past conflicts simply because we didn't do back then as good of a job picking them up, the remains, when they fell, as much as we do now.
Company, Yaya, the company mai jangali, Yaya, company, Yaya, jirgin zaman company. Grrrr.
you read accounts of the jungle warfare in Burma, honest accounts from writers without an imperialist agenda who often diminish or even just even if you want to even move away from the African story, but the general story of conditions in the jungle. I do not really describe it to you in an interview of this nature. The sheer horror, and literally these were basic conditions. Let's not forget that these troops were getting their supply lines from airdrops. To show you how remote this was. And many times their marches were through hundreds of miles of jungle terrain. And I say jungle, I mean proper jungle, right? Many times they're running sometimes over hundreds of meters up steep hills in mud, wading through mud and carrying heavy equipment in the hot sun, not just the hot sun, sometimes, humid conditions, rain, tropical rain, the kind that we have in Lagos, the kind that you have in like in the hinterland. These are the conditions these guys were in. Disease, dysentery, malaria. So the reality is that when you're marching and there are no trucks, there's no trucks to drive you through the jungle paths. Anything you carry, you have to carry on your back. Okay, so the reality is that if somebody dies in a firefight, even retrieving the body to go and bury on the spot was hard. Do you understand? So there are many bodies that the only way they were identified is that they had dog tags within the bones, decomposed bodies on the paths, if they happen to be found by people later on. People were killed there, and nobody came until, they were there for how long? How long the bodies aren't going to be sitting down there waiting? They decompose, they get eaten by vultures, they get eaten by animals. You see that number of 15,000 is even is an understatement, because the reality is that let's not even forget the merchant seamen, because the merchant seamen, even though they were civilians, many of them died at sea, keeping the supply lines open. And also at least they had combat capability, because many of them were gunners on those merchant ships. Gone. Over 5,000 African merchant seamen died in that war. So but my point is that there were thousands of others who didn't have military medals or DCMs, but who fought gallantly in that war. And if you didn't have those, the Ministry of Defense, the British Ministry of Defense, who I've been working with for the last 14 years, have those records in huge files which are not publicly accessible as of now, in spite of the Freedom of Information provisions. There's the declassification regime that really ought to exist. So it's been a problem, but I'm finally getting around to working with getting those records out so they're readily accessible, so people can actually access their records. World War I is slightly different, because every single soldier that participated, that received a victory medal, or participation in that war, that's you were there. Once you fought longer than 2 weeks, you were there. You got a medal. Those are accessible, and I can, at the click of a button, I can bring up the records. But with World War II, there were a lot more, and it was harder to keep track of those who fought and those who died.
Thank you for watching. I hope you've picked up a lesson or two, as I have, in this very important episode. And until next time, when we bring you another great story making waves across the Atlantic, I'm Oyiza Adaba. See you next time.